Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 9th out of our 10th lectures in the spring 2021 lecture series. It's amazing how much we've done over the course of just the last few weeks and how we've been together for 9 weeks, and so many of our community either has participated in person with us on Zoom or have watched the links when we put them out on Facebook or on YouTube afterwards. It's exciting to see so many people involved in history and interested in learning military history. And I appreciate all of you being here. Tonight, as we begin all of our lectures, we would like to begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. And let me just move forward my screen here. Oh, let me go back one too far. So as we begin all of our programs at the USS Silversides, let us begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We have another incredible lecture for us to have, but as always, we're very grateful for our series sponsor, the Lorraine F. Birch and the Fred S. Birch Foundation. They're a West Michigan couple who spent their entire lives promoting education and community service. And they are generous, their family is generously supporting our lecture series this evening. And so thank you very much. We appreciate all of that.
Fine, you can get in a comfy chair and get all ready to sleep.
Now, our media sponsor is Blue Lake Public Radio. They have been a wonderful sponsor to the museum, and we appreciate all that they do, and we appreciate having such a fine resource within our community.
And I can halfway hear.
To ask everyone
TV.
to please mute themselves so that we don't get any feedback during our programming. Okay. Now our lecture next week, can you imagine it's our 10th lecture? And when we discussed putting this lecture together, we looked for a demarcation point that would make a change to the era. And there was nothing more that could have made a change to the era within September 11th, 2001. I kind of look at it and think, wow, to me, it seems like just yesterday. And it was the first day that I took my youngest daughter to preschool. And now that youngest daughter is in law school. And so to me, the years seem like just yesterday, that it happened just yesterday, but it's really been 20 years. And it's an amazing amount of things that have changed in the course of that time. And we have looked at everything from post-Vietnam all the way up until September 11th. And it's been an incredible journey, and a journey that people do not often think about in terms of the American military. But our American military always comes to our aid, always comes to our defense, and they never know what they're being asked to do, no matter what it is. And I think of our current military right now being asked to help in the war against COVID, something that not many of them had ever anticipated, but it is. So next week, we will talk about 9/11 and what happened in terms of the American military, what happened in our society, and it'll be another exceptional lecture. Next one. Our lecture tonight talks about some things that we very seldom talk about here, a role of Americans overseas in Africa. There was a civil war going on in Africa. There was a genocide going on there. There was a lot of terrorism going on, and they were things that the United States needed to intervene in and then needed to act in. And so it's very interesting to have that time to talk about all these things that so many of our young people were involved in. Tonight's speaker is someone that everyone here is very familiar with. It's Fred Johnson from Hope College, and we're very excited to have Fred with us tonight. And without further ado, I will have Fred start up on his portion of the lecture. I ask again that everyone please mute their mics so that we do not get any feedback. And if you have any questions during the lecture, please put them in the chat box and I will send them. I have a chat here. I will send them to Fred, and if he's able to answer them at that point, if not, we will hold them at the end. But I again ask you make sure that everyone keeps their mics muted, and I will be watching for that to make sure that I mute any mics that come up, including my own, so that you don't hear my clock chiming. So without further ado, I turn it back over to Fred.
Good evening, Silverside scholars and friends and supporters. Thank you so much for joining us once more this evening for a lecture pertaining to the American military's role post-Vietnam and pre-9/11. And just as Peg said in that wonderful introduction, we're going to take a look at a part of American foreign policy, American military intervention, that very often we don't get very much exposure to, because frankly speaking, America's relationship with the African continent, going back as far as 1619, has been a very troubled one, a very sketchy one, sometimes a very turbulent one. And in the post-war world, during the Cold War, Africa became very important to the United States because of its being an outpost, for example, for the United States to radio information inside of the Soviet Union behind the East Bloc. I mentioned that from experience because for a time, I was working on a Voice of America radio contract with a company where we were at a VOA site just outside of Monrovia, Liberia. And that site in Monrovia, its sole function, its main purpose was to send Western news, Western media, Western information behind the Iron Curtain. So that was in Liberia. That was also American presence we had in Somalia, also in Ethiopia, also in Kenya, and at various times in Tanzania. Now, the Cold War rivalries on the African continent were very, very complex, as was the whole Cold War itself. But let's pick it up right here. You had a great presentation on Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield, then followed by Desert Storm. That entire evolution lasted roughly from August 2nd, 1990 to February 28th, 1991. America came out of Desert Storm as a nation that for itself and for the world seemed to have found its footing again as far as foreign policy was concerned. You recall that I mentioned that when our heroes came home, and they were nothing less than heroes, when the women and men came home from Desert Storm, it was a victory over Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard, the Iraqi invader that had invaded Kuwait. President Bush put together a legitimate, bona fide, for real coalition of nations that simply decided that they were not going to stand for the kind of overt, naked aggression that Saddam Hussein had committed inside of the Middle East. So our American military came home to parades that people, frankly, I don't think people have seen since World War II. Let's keep going. It was a wonderful sign of the kind of change that had occurred in the American populace and among Americans, so different than the very unfair, the very undignified, the very shameful lack of welcome that our women and men received upon coming home from Vietnam. And to a similar extent, even coming home from Korea or Korean War veterans. This is why you all have heard me say on a number of occasions that while we're remembering our veterans from the more recent wars, I don't ever want to forget the sacrifice and the contribution of our Korean War veterans and our Vietnam veterans, because they too were part of those generations of gatekeepers that helped bring down the Soviet Union and end the Cold War. And it was a triumph of American freedom, democracy, and capitalism. But after Vietnam, there was a lot of soul searching. Who were we as a nation? Who were we as a people? What was the role of the American military? Could the American military be relied upon to be the partner internationally to respond in times of crisis? Even if we did respond in times of crisis, could we get the job done? Recall that in our series, we talked about the Mayaguez incident where the Cambodian pirates took the Mayaguez. And even though we got that shit back, it wasn't necessarily a smooth operation. No operation ever goes smoothly, but some go less smoothly than others. And then there was a situation in the late 1970s, early 1980s with the Iran hostage crisis. We talked about Operation Eagle Claw and the debacle that happened at Desert One, the attempt to rescue the American hostages that have been there day after day, well over 300 days, well over 380 days, on and on it seemed to go. And then that rescue attempt ended up as a disaster in the desert. So people were wondering, what's happened to the United States? We are a superpower, but are we just like a superpower that, like the travels of Gulliver, got tied down by Lilliputians? What's going on? And you can see from this slide right here that Vietnam memorials were raised in West Virginia, New Jersey, Colorado. Vietnam was something that was etched deep into the American consciousness. This one in Missoula, Montana. This one that pays tribute to American nurses and participation of women during the Vietnam conflict. And this one showing, unlike a lot of war statues that I show, giving heroic kind of pose, this goes to show the strain and the stress, and also the diversity of participation during the Vietnam conflict. Not to sit up and shame the soldiers, not to say that they didn't do their job, but just to once and for all bring it down and let people understand the real tragedy that was Vietnam, the real sacrifice that was made during Vietnam, so that people would understand that in the future, we must not forget the sacrifice of those young women and those young men as we ventured forward. That was part of the self-introspection. But while people were asking those questions about who are we, where are we going, and what are we going to do, and can we get it done if we go there, wherever there was, all the while, you would think that after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of communism and we win the Cold War, that there might be time to take a breath, to take some rest, to enjoy the victory. But you all know humanity. Humanity is what it is. And while one evil was being vanquished, there was another evil rushing to take its place, a greater evil. And that greater evil was named Osama bin Laden. By the time we started getting closer to the 21st century, Osama bin Laden had already infiltrated Afghanistan and began planning. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on him because the point that I want to make about Osama bin Laden and people like him is that cowards do cowardly things. They slither, they skulk in the shadows. Cowards like Heinrich Himmler, who waged unrelenting war against the Jews in Germany. He was the one that ran the machinery for the Holocaust, that ran the system of death camps inside of Europe. When it came time to actually pay the cost of justice, to pay the price of justice for his crimes, what did he do? He committed suicide, denying the world the justice that it so rightly deserved. Cowards do cowardly things. Hermann Goering, at one time Hitler's number 2, when it came time for him to face justice, what did he do? He committed suicide. Justice would not have its day with him either. Why? Because cowards do cowardly things. He denied the world the justice that it so rightly deserved. And then this guy, Idi Amin Dada, so he called himself. The one-time leader of Uganda, the dictator, the man that waged war on his own people, the man that, quite frankly, began some processes and began some movements and changes inside of Uganda that has a current civil war still going on in that country right now, especially in the northern part. When it came time for justice to deal with him, and he owed the world a great debt of justice, especially to the Ugandan people, for the hundreds of thousands that he killed under his rule, Idi Amin fled to Saudi Arabia and found sanctuary. The world did not get his justice from Idi Amin. Other things were happening as we got closer to the 21st century. In China, for example, in Tiananmen Square, there was the great standoff between the Chinese army, and many of you might remember watching the news program, that one lone individual who stood in the road in front of a column of Chinese tanks. That guy became a hero overnight. But in Tiananmen Square, the Chinese people who were moving a movement inside of China, people could not believe this when they saw it, that people inside of communist China, the largest communist nation in Asia, were demanding freedom, greater freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of everything that Americans hold dear to themselves, but it was put down by force. By 1990, the chains of so many things that had been holding people back began to break, especially on the continent of Africa. Now, I use this map purposely because by 1990, the continent of Africa, you'll know if you look to the northeastern part of the continent, you'll see Egypt. Many people forget that Egypt is on the African continent. And a lot of that territory that the Israelis and the Egyptians were fighting over, the 1960s and the 1970s, the West Bank and those areas, that extends from Egypt into the Middle East. And there's of course the Red Sea. If you look further to the east, you'll see Sudan. Now Sudan, currently today, there's North Sudan and Southern Sudan. At the time, Sudan was this large country that was so big, and the nation was divided just a few years ago. So they thought to try and bring peace to an ongoing civil war. So this is a map that is consistent with the time period that I'm talking about. And then if you look at Ethiopia, Ethiopia shares a border with Eritrea. Eritrea and the Ethiopians have been fighting off and on for years over a piece of desert called the Ogaden Desert region. And then if you look even further east at Somalia, Somalia is in that part of Africa called the Horn of Africa because it's said to resemble a rhinoceros horn. So the Horn of Africa, and then further south, there's Kenya. Kenya has the port of Mombasa, which is a natural deep water port. It is a port facility which is very important to the US Navy for its operations in the Indian Ocean. And in Somalia, Mogadishu is another port that at the time was very valuable for to the US Navy for operations in Indian Ocean, particularly at a place called Diego Garcia. In Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, the major city there, is another major point of interest for American policymakers when it comes to regional security in Africa and America's interest in the Indian Ocean. So there's so many things going on in the African continent. During the Cold War, if you look to the eastern part of the continent, in Angola, there was for decades a civil war going on in Angola, a Portuguese-speaking country because it was settled by or colonized by the Portuguese. And then of course in South Africa. In South Africa, there was the apartheid regime, the white minority rule in South Africa that eventually caused so much consternation that the world said enough was enough. South Africa, apartheid. This was the nation of Nelson Mandela, who spent more than 20 years in prison fighting for the freedom of people, all South Africans. In the early 1990s, miracles began to happen on the African continent, particularly in South Africa. It would be appropriate, I think, to take a moment to listen to Mary Makeba singing Nkosi Sikelele Africa. It's called the African National Anthem. Just listen to the beautiful melodies here celebrating the coming of freedom to South Africa. Here we go.
God bless Africa.
Get my share screen with you all again. Here we are. There were some great things coming to the African continent. Some really, really wonderful things about to happen. But there are also some troubling things that are about to happen as well. In South Africa, in the early 1990s, Nelson Mandela would be released from captivity, would be released from prison. Nelson Mandela had begun life early in his life as being a member of what eventually became the African National Congress. And the African National Congress was referred to by the South African government as a terrorist organization. Nelson Mandela became a chief leading figure in that organization, and they were fighting against primarily apartheid. And eventually, Mandela, this soon to be legendary figure, his wife here, Winnie Mandela, they became partners in the general struggle to end apartheid in South Africa. He spent 27 years at this facility pictured here, Robben Island. For 27 years, he was there. And while there became something of a minor celebrity, this is a picture from Mandela's time there. I don't belabor the point, but it turned out that Mandela was more effective in prison, became a larger symbol in prison than he had been outside of it. But the time for change was coming, and he went from being a young man to a not so young man, and finally to an elderly man by the time he left the prison. And this is a picture of Mandela, not in prison, but after he had been freed. You see that microphone clipped to his tunic there, his shirt, as he came back to visit where the exact cell where he had been staying. And on February 26, 1990, he was set free. And it seemed like a brand new chapter, and a brand new chapter had begun for Africa, and especially for South Africa. And it did begin in South Africa, a brand new chapter. The walls of apartheid began to fall. It was the South African equivalent of Jim Crow segregation that ended in America in the 1960s, or at least the attempts to make it end, to pass legislation, to have a more equitable and just society. So you see here, Nelson Mandela with his fist raised with his wife, Winnie Mandela. And the United States and the American government and the American corporations begin to divest. I remember news stories like Harvard University and other major universities across the country that begin to divest their financial holdings from South Africa. So through a combination of diplomacy, internal pressure, external pressure, South Africa finally relented and got rid of the apartheid system. As you can see here from this news article, Mandela freed urges the pressure to stop the white minority government. And this is the last president of South Africa shaking hands with Nelson Mandela. It was just an amazing thing to see. And they called him Madiba. Madiba was a term of endearment that Nelson Mandela was given. But in that same period, in early 1990s, we're talking from December 5th, 1992 to May 4th, 1993, in another part of Africa, particularly in the Horn of Africa. I'm talking about that area of Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Somalia. You can see here that the map focuses upon, look at the green area, Somalia. It would be helpful for us to remember that Somalia in the early part of the 20th century had been a colony, had been colonized by both the British and the Italians, but by the Italians especially. The Ethiopians were colonized by the Italians in the early 20th century because in the late 19th century, when European nations began gobbling up territory in the African continent, the Italians were beaten by the Ethiopian people in 1896 at the Battle of Ottawa, and it was a humiliating defeat that the Italian people never forgot. Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, when he came to power, he vowed to get vengeance on the Ethiopian people, and he eventually did in the 1930s. Somalia was another Italian province, and there in Somalia in the early 1990s, there was a man named Mohammed Farah Aidid. Now, let me say this very carefully, because you know, different nations organize themselves in different ways according to their culture. Some people might call it clans, other people say tribes, other people different social units. Think about how we are inside the United States. People have said that in the United States, we are such a hyper individualized society. We are atomized. Everybody's in their own little silo. In Somalia, the general situation throughout most of their history is that people have been organized into large family groups called clans. And Mohammed Farah Aidid was the leader of a clan. Now, he was given the name warlord. Whether he was or not was a situation for the Somali people to figure out, to decide. But to Western eyes, Mohammed Farah Aidid was a warlord and a brutal warlord at that. Let's take a look at what's going on here. January 1991, Somali President Mohammed Siad Barre was overthrown. Siad Barre was the last leader of Somalia. I mentioned to you all that in the dynamics of the Cold War, Somalia at different times was an American ally, and at other times it was a Soviet ally. Same thing with Ethiopia. Sometimes it was an American ally, other times it was a Soviet ally. The thing about these African nations was this: they knew that they were too weak to stand up to either superpower on their own. So what they did, not having the muscle and the strength to stand up on their own, they played the Soviet Union and the United States off against each other. That's why maybe on Monday and Tuesday, the Ethiopians are allies of the Soviets, but on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, they're allies with the United States. Same thing with the Somalis. Maybe on Sunday and Monday, they're friends with the US, but on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, they're friends with the Soviets. It depended upon what they needed and the internal politics of each country. After Siad Barre was overthrown, the two main factions in Somalia took control of Mogadishu, the capital city. They were led by one man named Ali Mahdi Muhammad, and the other one was led by Muhammad Farah Aidid. Now, there was a ceasefire that was agreed upon in late September, but then fighting broke out one more time. At the time, there were so many people killed, and look, it's a civil war, and a civil war does what a civil war does. It displaces people. It causes mass suffering. Medical services cannot be given or cannot be delivered. People get hungry. And in Somalia's case, in addition to the social disruption, in addition to the breakdown of civil society, there was eventually a famine that settled upon the land. In this case, a combination of drought, meaning climate, but also man-made conditions that led to thousands and thousands of people dying because of starvation. And the world was watching this and asking the question, what do we do? How can we help? Some cases, should we help? Should we get involved in a civil war to feed people? Well, the United States in the early 1990s, with President George H.W. Bush still being president, decided that yes, the time had come for the United States to help the Somali people, because it turned out that Muhammad Farah Aidid, in addition to wanting to run the Somali nation and being a strong man inside of Mogadishu, he also was using international food aid sent by nations from around the world. He was taking that food and using it as a weapon against his own people or against the Somali people. So here we have a situation then where people are starving. The world has responded by sending food aid, and the food is piling up on docks or in different other locations, and it can't get to the people who need it because Muhammad Farah Aidid and his followers are using it as a weapon to leverage power. President Bush decided that it was time to step in and aid the Somali people in something called Operation Restore Hope. President Bush went on TV, like many American presidents have done, to explain why it was necessary for the United States to get involved in this nation that maybe many Americans didn't know about and maybe didn't care about, to explain why we could not let fellow human beings be left alone to be starved to death by a man who was interested only in gaining power and using food to gain that power for his own benefit. Here's President Bush's address.
I want to talk to you today about the tragedy in Somalia and about a mission that can ease suffering and save lives. I've seen the shocking images from Somalia. The scope of suffering there is hard to imagine. Already, over 250,000 people, as many as people as live in Buffalo, New York, have died in the Somali famine. In the months ahead, 5 times that number. 1.5 million people could starve to death. For many months now, the United States has been actively engaged in the massive international relief effort to ease Somalia's suffering. All told, America has sent Somalia 200,000 tons of food, more than half the world total. This summer, the distribution system broke down. Truck convoys from Somalia's ports were blocked. Sufficient food failed to reach the starving in the interior of Somalia. And so in August, we took additional action. In concert with the United Nations, we sent in the U.S. Air Force to help fly food to the towns. To date, American pilots have flown over 1,400 flights, delivering over 17,000 tons of food aid. And when the UN authorized 3,500 UN guards to protect the relief operation, we flew in the first of them, 500.
Okay, now you heard President Bush. Here's the president saying that the U.S. Air Force had already flown missions to bring some relief to the Somali people. This goes back to a conversation, some observations that Peg had during our last session about the purposes of the U.S. military. The Korean War, We understood what that was. That was about North Korean aggression against South Korea and an ally. The military had to be used in that situation. The Vietnam War, it was a civil war, but it also had a very, very distinct military flavor to it. So it was proper to deploy the military to that situation. Likewise, with Saddam Hussein's naked aggression, when he invaded Kuwait, you used the military to get your ally, to get the aggressor off the back of your ally. But now you're talking about a different purpose for the American military. We're talking about the 1990s. The 21st century is almost here. And the American military now finds itself, not for the first time, this was not the first time the American military had done this, but now for a new generation. The military is being used in addition to peacekeeping operations, which the military will be used for, now for humanitarian relief, flying food to people that can't get it in the middle of a civil war, where the person that is stopping that food shipment is intentionally doing so. So what are the rules of engagement under that situation? What's the mission objective? Now, you heard the president say that there were UN troops already there. So the United Nations was already there, which meant that it was already an international mission. The US Air Force was already deployed. When the Air Force deploys planes to a region, that means you deploy ground personnel as well, ground support personnel. Eventually what happened was that the decision was made to deploy more American ground personnel, not to support the aircraft, but to change the situation on the ground and build up a troop presence on the ground. Nothing so stands out about the purpose or the intent to do that. And to show, and this essentially foreshadowed so much of what would eventually go wrong in Somalia. Then this CNN report where Christian Amanpour, for those of you that have been in the military, I want you to try and wrap your minds around this. Maybe you'll feel the way I felt when I saw this, when it happened. That American special forces landing at night on the beach of Somalia. When they got there, who's there but news cameras and lights and CNN reporters? How are you supposed to have any kind of an operation that has any secrecy at all if the media is there reporting everything you do? It left many American military planners pulling their hair out with frustration, wondering whose job was it to keep this thing a secret? Take a look.
U.S. military action is now underway. We're going to show you some pictures of our special night vision camera. As you can see, the beaches are all lit up. There's been a lot of activity along the beach just by the airport for the last several hours. A couple of hours ago, the first advanced units, the Special Forces, Navy SEALs, and CB units came ashore. They are here to prepare the way for the main marine landing, which should take place in the next few hours. They're here to haul in lights and landing gear and facilitate the main marine landing. Shortly after we spotted the first Special Forces. Then we spotted a handful of Marines that came ashore. They came from the sea onto the beach and then moved into the bushes towards the Mogadishu airport. As they landed, of course, they were met by a gang of press. The press has been in Mogadishu at the airport waiting for the U.S. arrival, and so rushed to meet the Marines. They asked plenty of questions. Where are you from? What are you doing? They were given no answer. The Marines just simply continued going along their way. And then shortly afterwards, a Marine spokesman rowed ashore and complained. He was very disgruntled to complain to the press about its presence there.
There may be some armed people in the area that could cause some harm to our guys. And we don't want you people to be close to it. All right, and for your safety and their safety, just we need you to move as far down the beach as you can. And pretty much stay together.
I must tell you all that I can only agree with Lieutenant Kurt Coker. He was absolutely right that the press was endangering themselves, but also endangering those troops. I was never in Marine Corps Force Recon, so let me be very clear about that. But I had a platoon commander from OCS who was a Marine Corps Force Recon, and those guys are not in the habit of going around announcing what they're about to do in a special operation. So to land ashore and to find the press there, to have a press briefing and a press conference like it's just another day literally on the beach, did not make these Marines happy. Well, 1992 was an election year, the same year that President Bush deployed the Marines and Special Operations Forces to Somalia. And in that election season, there were three candidates, Ross Perot. Some of you may remember Ross Perot and that famous phrase he said, talking about American jobs, that big sucking sound that you hear are American jobs going overseas. President Bush, of course, who had made that promise, read my lips, no new taxes, then raise taxes. And then there was the governor from Arkansas, the one they called Slick Willie, William Jefferson Clinton. Bill Clinton won the election. And it was that presidential election season, it was a bruiser because Ross Perot was brand new to politics, but he was a guy that would not back down. And Bill Clinton proved himself to be a very, very formidable campaigner. And of course, President Bush, being the president, had the advantage of the office and incumbency, and also had a tremendous resume. But at the end of the day, when it was all over with, William Jefferson Clinton and his vice presidential pick, Al Gore, the senator from Tennessee, became the president and vice president of the United States. So Bill Clinton became the 42nd president of the United States. And while Bill Clinton is becoming the 42nd president of the United States, the situation in Somalia continued to get worse and worse and worse. You can see here, sometimes the cover of Time magazines and other articles and just pictures tell the story so much better than any narrative could. Stand to deliver with tough choices at home and a dangerous world abroad, Bill Clinton takes charge. And the most dangerous thing that happened was that the decision was made to whether or not trying to figure out how do you provide air support, or should you provide air support to your ground troops that are trying to work to get this food to the Somali people. Now, there was a writer named Mark Boughton who wrote a book entitled Black Hawk Down. Very good book. And there was a movie made by the same name. Again, Mark Boughton, Bowden, in which he wrote about the actual events that happened in Mogadishu when two American Black Hawk helicopters, you see the Black Hawk helicopter, which I believe still is the main helicopter used by the Army today. The Black Hawk helicopter, two of them were shot down. And when they were shot down, it began a 2-day long battle called the Battle of Mogadishu, where American forces basically had to fight an entire city that were determined to capture them and beat the Americans back to their base outside of the city. As I say, they eventually made it into a movie, a very good movie, and it's a very, very dramatic tale. The Battle of Mogadishu is a battle that I don't think very many Americans know about. And what happened when that Black Hawk helicopter was shot down was some of the most heroic fighting of the 1990s, again, showing the American military on display, American heroism at its finest. One of the pilots that was shot down was Warrant Officer Michael Durant. Mike Durant was taken prisoner by the Somalis. Some of the other helicopter pilots that were shot down were killed. Hold on a second, let's take a look. From Black Hawk Down.
Super 6-1 is hit. He is hit. Walcott's bird is hit. We got a Black Hawk down.
Scholars of the Silver Side.
99% of people are living in a
Wait a
delusion.
minute.
America is in.
Scholars of the Silver Sides. This was a tough moment for the American military. Mike Durant was taken prisoner. You see here his picture on the cover of Time magazine, October 18th, 1993. What in the world are we doing is the title of the special report. Anatomy of the disaster in Somalia. How did something with such noble intentions, so many noble intentions, we deploying the military to use the force of the military to fly or truck food to people who need it? People who are over 200,000 people, well over 200,000 people, eventually 300,000 people who are dying of starvation, climate partly, but mostly man-made starvation because of one man's aggressive behavior. And by October 1993, it had become a disaster. Mike Durant was still a prisoner. And these images came out of Somalia as well. And these images caused a lot of anger and frustration inside of the United States. Because, let me speak very forthrightly and frankly, given our racial history in this country, many people did not understand a whole lot about Africa to begin with, and even less about American foreign policy in Africa. And when you're told that you're going to go to a country and help people who are in need and they're starving and they need you, and we went there with good intentions to help people, and all of a sudden they're shooting your helicopters out the sky and then dragging your pilots through the streets, and it appears that people are celebrating that. Listen, this angered many Americans. How do you, if you're in Washington, D.C. and you're a policymaker, how are you explaining this to the mom and dad in Peoria, Illinois? How are you explaining this to the mom and dad in Dallas, Texas, or the mom and dad in Oakland, California, or the mom and dad in Grand Rapids, Michigan, for that matter? How do you tell them that this is actually a good thing that we're doing? So people's tastes and their patience with the American mission in Somalia got real quick, real fast. I mean, got real short, real fast. There wasn't really anything President Clinton could say. The Battle of Mogadishu was underway. But even while all that was going on, while we were getting caught up in Mogadishu, something was happening back in America. Let me go back one slide. February 26, 1993, 12:18 Eastern Time. Let me say that one more time. February 26, 1993, 12:18 Eastern Time. In the United States, in the city of New York. This man who was a citizen of New York, or who lived in New York, his name was Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman. And in part of his speeches, he was a blind cleric, and he had been heard in some of his speeches talking about destroy the edifices of capitalism. And he lived in Brooklyn, New York. On that day, stay with me, at 12:18 Eastern Time on that day, the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center were shaken, rocked, because a truck bomb went off in the basement, the parking garage beneath both buildings. In other words, this was the first attempt by an organization called Al-Qaeda that targeted the World Trade Center to try and bring them down. We know what eventually happened. They couldn't bring them down. They couldn't topple them from below, so they eventually will topple them from above. But this is the beginning. When you connect the dots up to 9/11, at some point you begin to ask yourself, not how could it have happened, but how could it not have happened? They were already trying to bring down the World Trade Center in 1993. The Twin Towers, a truck bomb. And Sheikh Abdul Rahman was implicated. And of course, there was an investigation. And of course, people were rounded up. And a man named Ramzi Youssef, his was a name that will become very familiar to us later on as well. Ramzi Youssef was implicated. And I won't take us through all of the investigation of what happened. Let's just say that the attempt to bring down the World Trade Center in 1993 failed. And then other events began to happen around the world where the United States or America, the American military or American military outposts were targeted again and again and again. On June 25th, 1996, remember Saddam Hussein? Saddam Hussein, who had been kicked out of Kuwait because of Operation Desert Storm, Desert Shield and Desert Storm. You all remember that from the wonderful presentation by Ron Jankowski. After Desert Storm, American military forces and NATO forces, coalition forces, essentially put Saddam Hussein under house arrest inside of Iraq by establishing a northern and southern no-fly zone. The American Air Force was stationed in Saudi Arabia at a place called Khobar Tower. That's where American military forces stayed. Now, you had to understand something about the long history of the Middle East and the Crusades and the Western presence there and colonialism and imperialism and the bad, turbulent history of colonialism and race and everything that goes into the Middle East. It is those are some of the very factors that continue to make foreign policy difficult in the Middle East right now, not to mention religion and culture and history. But in 1996, the US Air Force had personnel staying in a place in Saudi Arabia called Khobar Towers. So we have Air Force personnel staying there in Saudi Arabia. And they were there for something called Operation Southern Watch. Operation Southern Watch was, here's a map, you can see the no-fly zone. You see where Baghdad is in Iraq? You see Turkey to the north, and Iraq to the southeast of Turkey. And the UN forces, rather coalition forces, had a no-fly zone to the north and a no-fly zone to the south. Every time Saddam Hussein or the Iraqi Air Force launched an aircraft, they would meet a coalition a US Air Force response in the north or the south. Saddam Hussein had essentially been reduced to being the mayor of Baghdad. He was a threat to the Iraqi people, which was horrible. But the whole point of getting him out of Kuwait was to confine him in Iraq, not to change regimes or nation build. We'll get into that business later on. Now, part of what was going on with Operation Southern Watch was that those Air Force personnel who worked on the aircraft that responded to those Iraqi flights in the northern or southern no-fly zones, their whole job was to make sure that the Iraqi aircraft never got airborne at all or long enough to do any kind of damage anywhere in the region. And they did a doggone good job. But people knew where those Air Force personnel were staying. Khobar Towers, as you can see from the sign here. And in 1996, this is a picture of the Khobar Towers. On June 25th, 1996, you see this truck bomb right here? A truck bomb went off, killing a large number of American military personnel. This gives you an idea of that truck bomb sheared off an entire side of a building. This is another look at the damage. This car bombs were becoming more and more, not so much a unique thing, but definitely becoming more and more the weapons or points, the vehicles, literal vehicles of choice used by terrorists to strike the United States and its allies. Secretary of Defense William Perry went to the Middle East to literally visit the destruction at Khobar Towers. For that incident, 4 men were implicated: Ahmed Ibrahim al-Mughassi, Ali Saeed bin Ali Huri, Ibrahim Salih Muhammad al-Yaqub, and Abdelrahman Hussein Muhammad al-Nasser. They became on the most wanted terrorist lists. This was a letter from President Khatami from President Clinton. The United States government has received credible evidence that members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, along with members of Lebanese and Saudi Hezbollah, were directly involved in the planning and execution of the terrorist bombing in Saudi Arabia of the Khobar Towers residential complex on June 25th, 1996. So look, I'm not going to read that whole thing, but here we are one more time. The Iranians, so it was alleged, the Iranians were behind the attack on Khobar Towers along with Hezbollah, which is supported by the Iranians allegedly. So these two very, very aggressive organizations had launched this attack upon American military personnel in 1996. But you know something? It gets even thicker. Now, I just want to say this and then we'll take some questions. On August 7th, 1998, can you feel a building momentum? The truck bomb at the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers in 1993, and then the attack on Khobar Towers in 1996. And then on August 7th, 1998, something even more devastating happened. And it happened in Kenya. It happened in Nairobi, Kenya, but also in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. If you look at Kenya and Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, to African people in East Africa, they call that East Africa. Most Americans will look at the map of the continent of Africa, they cut it into 4 squares. They would include Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia. East Africans consider Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya as East Africa. That's the designation that they give it. But on that day in 1998, within moments of each other, 2 bombs went off at the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and another bomb went off at the U.S. Embassy in Kenya, within moments of each other. Follow me. 2 bombs, 2 different countries, 2 different capitals, within moments of each other. There's absolutely no way that was circumstantial. Absolutely no way that was accidental. Somebody meant that to happen. And in this particular picture showing the U.S. Embassy in Kenya, glass was blown out for thousands of feet. People had their faces shredded. Scholars of the Silver Sides, I don't know if it was a privilege or just an opportunity, but either way, I found myself in Kenya not too long after this explosion, and I walked the ruins of the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi. I was there months later, and the rubble was still incredible to be cleaned up. Look at the force of this blast. Look what it did to this building. We were at war. Certainly policymakers knew something was afoot. We were at war and building towards something, a crisis of catastrophic proportions. And of course, the Kenyan people, the Tanzanian people held candlelight vigils for their wounded and their dead. Madeleine Albright eventually came, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright eventually came to Dar es Salaam to look at the ruins of the buildings. And the forensic evidence led to these 6 individuals being implicated for the bombings at Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And then I'll mention this and then we'll take some questions. October 2000. Now we're literally at the 21st century. 2000. Like Peg said at the very beginning of this, 20 years ago, it doesn't seem like that much time could have passed, but it has. October 20th, 2000, in Yemen, a U.S. naval warship called the USS Cole had a hole blown in the side of it when a small craft came up alongside of it and a bomb exploded. Several U.S. sailors were killed. This was the next terrorist attack on American military targets or American personnel. Look at the size of that hole in the USS Cole. We were not actively at war with somebody, but somebody was actively at war with us. Let's take a look at this real quick, and we'll take some questions. This is from the 20th anniversary of the bombing of the USS Cole.
Day, 17 sailors on board the Norfolk-based USS Cole were killed. Almost 40 others were injured in a terrorist attack. So in honor of those sailors who lost their lives 2 decades ago, Naval Station Norfolk is holding a commemoration ceremony later this morning. And Dana Smith is live in Norfolk with what we've learned from that attack. Dana, good morning.
Good morning, Ashley. The attack on the USS Cole was a suicide bombing, and it came at a time when terrorism wasn't something a lot of Americans even thought about. The attack came 11 months before 9/11. Most Americans had never heard of Al-Qaeda. 20 years ago in Yemen, suicide bombers pulled up alongside the guided missile destroyer as it refueled and blew a 40 by 40-foot hole in the side of the ship. 17 sailors died, while 39 others were hurt. Retired Navy Captain Joe Bouchard says the Navy is smarter today when it comes to counterterrorism efforts.
The intelligence agencies, DOD, and the services significantly.
I'm gonna stop that right there. You all heard the newscaster say, on the day that the USS Cole was attacked, most Americans had not even heard of Al-Qaeda. You remember how after 9/11, you didn't hear about anything but Al-Qaeda? If you look at what happened in 1993, the attack on the World Trade Center with the truck bomb, and then the attack on Khobar Towers in 1996, then the twin embassy bombings in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi in 1998, and then the attack on the USS Cole in the year 2000. And then the eventual attack on the World Trade Center again on September 11, 2001. The evidence suggests that it wasn't a question of if, but when they were going to do it again. And it was the attack on 9/11 that we'll talk about next week that launched America onto a global war of terror. Eventually was the doorway that got us into the second Iraq War, Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. And it's the foundation upon which so much of our foreign policy stands today, that we're trying to either end by getting out of Afghanistan or asking ourselves again the question, what do we do now? Given that this has been one of the longest conflicts we've ever been in. But I trust that through this presentation and the other ones at least, we have been able to connect the dots to see how we were, where we were, has taken us to this point. I'll take your questions.
Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you would like. We're open to all questions, and I will not hog the whole time, so I'll give you guys a chance to ask what you would like.
Is my microphone working now?
Yes, it is. It can hear you perfectly.
Oh, good.
I hear you, Cliff.
Okay, good to see you too. It wasn't earlier. Wonderful job, Fred. It's a difficult period of time for all of us.
Yeah.
You did a great job putting it together.
Thanks, Cliff. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And that's one of the reasons, you know, the study of history is so important, because at the time when we're walking through this, we probably see these as all just random events that have no ties together. And that leads me to the question I was going to ask, is that the military prepares for a lot of stuff that never happens. And they have their groups together, putting together plans to invade countries that you would never think would need to be invaded, or if someone did a first strike and what would happen. Can you talk a little bit about what the military does with, you know, I know that wasn't your particular area, but what does the military do? Who comes up with these ideas of where they're going to plan for invasions, even though the invasion may never happen?
You know, Peg, from what I understand, there are people whose job it is to ask the questions that may even sound ridiculous. Remember, we discussed briefly last week that, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, maybe late 19th, early 20th century, somebody must have asked the question, oh, you know, what do you think would ever happen if we fought Japan? Now, at the time, in 1900, 1905, 1904, 1905, America and Japan were pretty good friends, right? So in 1904, 1905, there was the Russo-Japanese War, and Theodore Roosevelt was the mediator between the Russians and the Japanese to bring peace to that conflict. So America didn't have a beef with Japan. And what eventually happened was that as America, with its bases in the Philippines and the riverboat squadrons in China, when Japan's aggressive tendencies in Asia, particularly China, began to cross swords with the United States, the relationship began to deteriorate. And there were other things as well. But at some point, that question of what would happen if we ever went to war in China, it didn't seem so impossible because it was looking more and more likely. Now, the question about what would happen if we ever went to war with Nazi Germany, I don't think anybody ever doubted that was going to happen. That had to be taken seriously because Germany was just so aggressive. But these other things, I mentioned that at one point during the 1980s, I participated in a international exercise called Northern Wedding Beauregard, because doctrine at the time during the Cold War said that if in fact the Russians were to invade Western Europe, it would be through one or two likely routes: through Berlin in Germany, straight into Western Europe, or down north through Norway. The Russians and the Norwegians share a common border. So based on that information, we developed war game scenarios. And I know that war game is probably not the best phrase to use, but let's say war exercises to answer the what if. And so those kind of things are always developed. And the other part, the thing that makes it so difficult, Peg, is this: we're always we're always practicing for the next war based on the last war. But of course, the last war was the last war, and the next war is going to be completely different, aside from the fact that it will involve misery and killing and refugees, the usual stuff that goes along with it. But you have to look at, that's why we have intelligence gathering to know troop compositions, force compositions, unit compositions, technology, what our likely opponents have, might be using against us, their tactics. I think it's in the book by The Art of War by Sun Tzu, where he mentions a battle is won long before you ever get to the battlefield. You have to know the person you're going to fight and learn them and study them. So, and let me speak from a fictional standpoint. You remember the book? There's the book Failsafe. In the book Failsafe, the character named Professor Walter Groteschella, he was a political scientist. His entire job, his whole job for the Defense Department was to run these scenarios about different events or scenarios in which the U.S. and the Soviet Union would engage in nuclear war. That's all he did. So based on that, and some other things I've done that are more in the real world, we have people whose job it is to think of these things, think of these scenarios, and then to design scenarios for our military to practice.
That seems to me amazing. I mean, I know it's there, and logically I understand. We plan for everything at the museum that's possible. I didn't think in a million years to plan for a pandemic, but you plan for absolutely everything else that you can possibly think of that could go wrong, and you put procedures into place. And I think it's rather brilliant that the American military does those kind of things. Does anyone have any other questions that they would like to ask?
Yeah, Fred, in the 80s, you and I were both involved in planning the next war, the invasion through the Fulda Gap, the defense of Berlin, etc. In the Army, in the active Army, did you do any planning for the 90s with the Middle East coming to the forefront instead of Europe?
I wasn't involved in any of that, Cliff, but you recall that what happened in the early 90s, I did mention that, one of the other things that we did in the 1990s was that, I think I did mention this in an earlier section, an earlier part of the series where we focused upon Central America, the wars in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. But I failed to mention that we also went after Noriega in Panama. Operation Just Cause. That also happened during President Bush's administration. So it's like your question and Pace's question are kind of aligned with each other, because it's like, what planning do we do? Well, the planning sometimes depends upon where the front shifts. And the front shifted from Europe to Central America to the Western Hemisphere. And then when things began to heat up in the Middle East, and they always have been hot to some extent in the Middle East, then we shifted our attention there. But just as you heard that news reporter say, Americans had not heard of Afghanistan, or rather not Afghanistan, but Al-Qaeda. One of the reasons why I wanted to do this series and this series the way, in the sequence we did, was because as Afghanistan was falling into civil war, that's Central Asia, not the Middle East. In Central Asia, Afghanistan falling into civil war creates an opportunity for Osama bin Laden to get inside that country and set up his terrorist camp to begin rehearsals for the eventual attack upon 9/11 or other terrorist attacks, such as the one against the USS Cole. So, our military, therefore, and our planning for it, to get the PEX question, has to be global in nature. And when I teach the foreign policy class at Hope, I tell my students, look, whether America likes it or not, we're a superpower. We are a global superpower. We have global responsibilities. And I get that people want American troops to come home and we take care of America first, but sometimes taking care of things over there is taking care of America first.
Very good.
But I don't recall being involved in the kind of planning that you were talking about. You can inform me of that.
Does anyone have any, Cliff, I actually meant to unmute mine and I muted yours, so I apologize. Please unmute yourself. Does anyone else have any other questions that they would like to ask this evening? If not, then I'll say thank you to everyone for coming tonight. It's another incredible lecture about a part of American history that we seldom talk about. It's a little too close, it's a little too far, and it's not in the common knowledge area of most people. And it's what we kind of put in the background. But when you look at many of our veterans that are taking significant roles in our society, these are the conflicts that they were involved in. And these are the people that are our current leaders, and these are the people that are looking forward, and they have these memories and they know what has happened in the past and how it can continue in the future. And it's amazing that they have that.
That's right. Our younger veterans, Peg, the ones who are running for Congress now, or, these veterans of the Iraq War, that's the Iraq War of 2003.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. So,
yes.
We have our Korean War veterans, our Vietnam veterans, the ones of my generation, post-Vietnam, but these are our younger veterans. And this is the heritage that they have inherited that we carry with them. And again, the women and men of our armed services, nothing but respect.
100%, which leads us to the mission of the Silversides. And that is exactly that. We honor our veterans through education and preservation. And I find it very hard for young people to honor something that they have absolutely no knowledge of. And that is our primary goal, is to build that respect for all of those veterans, because it's very easy to say, well, you were in during peacetime. No, our military has been involved in conflict after conflict, and so much has happened, even though there has not been big declared wars that we hear about in the news every evening. And so these lectures, they serve our purpose of our museum, and we can honor our veterans in many ways, but knowledge is so important, and that preservation, so that people can walk in the same footsteps of those people before and get an understanding. Well, thank you, everyone.
Right.
No, nothing says it better than Fred Johnson walking through the rubble in Kenya. That's firsthand knowledge. We can't lose that.
No, no. We're going to have to ask Fred if he's ever had his oral histories taken on his military experiences.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, well, we're just going to have to arrange that one day.
Okay. Well.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. We're very excited that you are here. We look forward to seeing you for our 10th and final lecture of the series. And I will tell you all the exciting things that are coming up at the Silversides over the next few months. They will all be virtual, and we are hoping that some of our near lectures in the near future and all the other events that we have planned will also take place in person. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Take care. Have a
Good
great
night.
evening. Good night, scholars. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. John, we are just wrapping up for the evening. Yeah, I apologize, John. We started at 6 o'clock Eastern time. And so you're just logging in as we're just ending up for the evening.
Just ending for the evening. Sorry,
Yeah.
I missed it. I just got
Oh,
back from,
that's all right. We will have, do you do Facebook?
I do have Facebook.
Okay, well, this lecture is recorded and probably Thursday or Friday, we will put it up on Facebook as a YouTube and you can watch it then.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I missed it.
Oh, well, we're sorry that you weren't there either, but we're just happy that you were able to come in and we're happy that we recorded it and you'll be able to watch it
Okay.
again. But next week we will be doing 9/11 and we start at 6 p.m. Eastern.
6 o'clock. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.